Hi everyone, we're going to have a look this week at the different perspectives that people have applied to studying human behaviour thought. So we're going to try to understand what psychology is and the different ways essentially we can understand it. So a couple of nice definitions here of psychology, and I think some of the key words here are behaviour. So we're interested in how humans behave, but also how they think, the mental processes that go on in our heads. And the point is that it's scientific. Okay, so really important to understand that psychology is a science. So we do experiments, we do studies, and look at behaviour systematically. Okay, so what's the point of all that then? Well, the main thing is really that it can help us understand human behaviour. To some extent, we're all amateur psychologists because everybody has looked at somebody at some point in time and said, I wonder why they've done that or why they behave in the way they do. So that's really what psychology is all about. But we can also use it to try to predict the way that people are likely to behave if we do certain things, and sometimes even try to control behaviour. Okay, so by making environments in a particular way, maybe we can control behavior. So for instance, maybe we can, people are interested in criminal psychology. Maybe by doing certain things in a certain way, we can reduce the rate of criminal reoffending or reduce the likelihood of children becoming criminals when they become adults, for example, by treating them in a particular way. Now, it's a relatively young science compared to the physical sciences, but people have been fascinated by what makes people tick, by why they behave the way they do for thousands of years. And academic psychology and scientific psychology have been around certainly since the early 19th century. Sports psychology is a bit younger, but it's based on the same principles as general psychology. Now, there are lots of different ways of trying to understand human behaviour, but for our purposes, we're going to try to kind of boil them down to 5 different perspectives that we're going to look at today. One of the most famous ones is the psychodynamic perspective that Freud developed. Okay, now Freud was a very famous psychologist, one of the earliest psychologists in academia, and he was very interested in people's development, particularly in their younger years. He argued that things that we have happen during childhood greatly influence our later behaviour, and he also argued that there are strong unconscious processes that underlie human behaviour. So he was very interested in our personality, and he developed a technique, psychoanalysis, that actually tries to cure people of psychological disorders. And that's still in use today by some psychologists. Okay, so Freud basically argued that there are 3 parts of our personality. There's the id, which is the kind of instinctive core to our personality, and that includes our most basic wants, most basic desires and instincts. There is our ego, which is the logical, reality-orientated part of our personality, and superego, which is our conscience, that Freud argued is basically the moral standards of society that we internalize. So, for example, our id might be saying, I want something now. It might be saying that I've seen, for example, something in a shop that I would really like, say a really nice piece of jewelry like a Rolex watch, and you might say, I really want that. The ego then says, well, I need to do a bit of planning on how to get this. Maybe For example, I could plan a robbery and rob the jewelers to get this Rolex watch. And then the superego would be saying, well, no, you can't do that. It's not right. It's not right to take other people's property by force. Okay? So that's basically the idea behind Freud's psychological approach. Not too many people use that approach in sport per se, although there are some, but it has been used to help understand, for example, aggression and violence in sport, with the idea that there may be strong aggressive instincts in human beings that lend themselves well to playing aggressively in sport. And Freudians have argued that sport actually provides a really positive function because it enables us to let out our aggressive instincts on the sports field while minimizing harm to other people, and rather than doing it in other situations where it might hurt people. So that's one approach. Slightly more recently then, in the early 20th century, behaviorism became very popular, and this is focused on measurable behavior. So behaviorists weren't really interested in what's going on in the brain and unconscious processes, because they said, well, we can't really measure it and tell what people are thinking. So instead it tried to understand behaviors. With, for example, Pavlov's famous research on dogs, which we'll have a look at a video clip of in class. So I don't want to say too much about that. But there were two types of conditioning that behaviorists described. Classical condition, which is where we respond in a certain way to a stimulus because for example, we achieve certain results from that. Operant conditioning refers to the use of rewards and punishments to increase or decrease the likelihood of behaviours. So it's a very mechanistic view that, if we push certain levers in somebody, we'll get a certain response. Then later on, the humanistic approach became very popular in the 1960s onwards, and it said, well, this behaviourist approach is really too mechanistic. It doesn't take account of individuals' own perceptions, their own goals in life, their motives, and these things are all really important. So the humanistic approach basically says that human beings all have a desire to self-actualize, that is, achieve our full human potential. And ultimately, that is the ultimate state of psychological development of somebody, when they self-actualize and achieve their full potential as a human being. But in order to do that, you have to move up a pyramid called the hierarchy of needs. So there are physiological needs like food and water we need to survive. Then we have safety needs, so we need to be safe. So we might need, for example, to have a house that is secure so that people can't, or animals can't come in and attack us or take our things. But then on a higher plane, we all have needs to belong to society, because human beings are social animals, and needs to be loved and love other people. Then we have self-esteem needs, and the argument is that when all those are fully met, it's only then that we can self-actualize and fully achieve our full potential. But the approach is focused very, very much on individuals' motivation to achieve that potential. Okay? And unlike the behaviorists, argue that human beings are free to make choices and help determine our own future. So it's not just a question of a stimulus and a response, but actually there's a lot that goes on in between those in our own mind that will influence our behaviour. It's a very popular approach in sport, actually, because you can see how it applies that, in sport, often what we want to do is self-actualise, achieve our full potential in our sport. So it fits that quite nicely, and there's quite a few sports psychologists who work from a humanistic perspective. The cognitive approach relates to what's going on in our brain, and the early cognitive approach, which was developed largely kind of after the Second World War, Donald Broadbent being a very famous early cognitive psychologist, it very much viewed the human being a bit like a computer, a bit like a sort of information processor, and it looked at how we process that information. So cognitive psychologists are really interested in things like how we process information that comes in, how we react to things, how we remember things, how we pay attention to things and perceive things. Now again, we can see how all these things might be really, really important in sports. So the cognitive approach has been very, very popular among sports psychologists. Then we have neuropsychology. And neuropsychology investigates the activity in our brain, So it's helped us understand how different areas of the brain relate to specific thoughts and feelings. And we can use different tools to measure activity in our brain. A lot of the research that's been done in neuropsychology is focused on people with brain injuries. So when a particular part is damaged, how might that impact on our function, for example? A relatively new school of thought is evolutionary psychology, which tries to explain behaviours and psychological traits as the product of natural selection. So it says that humans have evolved to exhibit particular traits and behaviours because they help the human race survive. So it's really important to survive that we can infer other people's emotions, for instance, because that might help us detect whether there's danger, whether somebody might be about to try to harm us, for instance, how we identify and prefer healthy mates to reproduce with. Cooperation with other people is crucial for human survival. So the argument here is again that humans have evolved to cooperate with others. We're fundamentally social animals. And also, controversially, evolutionary psychologists have argued that there are sex differences in behaviour that human beings have evolved to exhibit, which will, for obvious reasons, is a controversial area, but one we will talk about. One of the most recent areas of great interest to psychologists is behavioural genetics and biology more generally. So people have been very interested in the role of genetics and hormones in human behaviour. This idea that behaviours are encoded in our genes has been around for a long time, since the famous scientist Sir Francis Galton wrote a book called Hereditary Genius, where he argued that genius was something that could be inherited, was something that was, passed on. And actually, there's been loads of research on how behaviours might be impacted by genetics since then. So people are very interested in, is there a genetic component to our personality, to our intelligence, as Galton suggested, anxiety, attitudes, even sexuality has been examined. And the evidence suggests that a lot of these things do have a strong genetic component. So, for example, anxiety seems to be about 50% heritable. IQ seems to be about 70%, so which, when you crunch the numbers, means that about half our IQ level can be explained by heredity and about half by the environment. So again, controversial issues that we'll talk about a bit more in detail. Is there such a thing as a sports gene? Well, people have looked at genes that might help explain physical performance, but we know genes also seem to influence behavior as well. So we will talk about that. So, no approach is perfect. So, for example, scientific approaches, such as a neuroscientific approach, tend to ignore personal experiences that might be very important in psychology. Humanistic perspective does recognise this, but it's been criticised for not being very scientific in its methods. How do you prove that somebody is self-actualizing? How do you prove where somebody is on the hierarchy of needs? It's a bit woolly for people who are maybe more, for example, neuroscientifically inclined. Psychodynamic perspective has done psychology an enormous service because it focuses on the unconscious, which is very, very important in influencing behaviour. But the argument some people have used about that is that maybe it loses sight of socialization processes, which are going to be very important, and maybe free will. So behaviorists and Freudian psychologists don't really see that free will plays a role. Although, controversially, this is an argument that still rages in psychology. Hans Eysenck, one of the most famous psychologists in history, and somebody we'll talk about when we look at personality, argued that he never really understood what free will is meant to mean. If, as most psychologists accept, our behaviour is conditioned partly by our genes and partly by our environment, what does free will even mean? How does that fit into that? So that's a debate and discussion, again, I'm sure we'll have on our course. Biological perspectives reduces human beings to a set of mechanisms, which we may be to an extent, but then that doesn't take account of consciousness, and we don't really fully understand even what that is and how the environment influences our behaviour. So who's right? Well, actually, no one perspective is right. They all tell us a little bit about human behaviour, and we should look at them holistically to try to understand which perspectives seem to explain behaviour best. There's no one perspective. Maybe different perspectives explain different aspects of our behaviour. In sport and in other situations, better than others. So each perspective brings something to the table in terms of helping us understand human behaviour, and that's what makes psychology, for me, such a fascinating thing to study.